talking about marriage. Ever married, it's not easy. Okay, then this is part one. Just like a marriage is there and something to talk about. What is the state of marriage at the beginning here of the 21st century? Well, this last week down in Washington State in the United States of America, and Washington State, they passed a bill allowing or legalizing gay marriage. I guess it joins 6 other states in the United States and the District of Columbia that permit gay marriage. Here in Canada, we permit gay marriage up here as well. Ironically, this whole issue of gay marriage is in many ways stimulating a certain amount of discussion about what marriage is all about, and which is good from that standpoint. It gets people thinking a little bit about what marriage is all about. Arguably, when you're trying to understand what is by its very nature a human adventure, it's a human adventure in which you have 2 people who are undertaking to really participate as part of a reality live-action drama. Well, it gets to be sometimes profound and sometimes complex to understand what's going on and what it's all about. It's a little bit, and sometimes maybe it's like watching that TV series Lost. Where are you in this? A lot of people can be lost and trying to figure out which side is up. What's really going on. Ever married? It's not easy. Marriage is sometimes a complex and a profound, institution, human institution. The goals of marriage, its purposes, its challenges, its difficulties, its success and joys, or its failure and despair tend to occupy really front and center stage in a lot of people's lives. And it affects all sorts of people. It affects schools and teachers. It affects hospitals and doctors, writers and publishers, police and prison, lawyers and judges, ministry and counselors. There's a whole supporting cast, including undertakers, friends, and extended family that get involved in the marriages of our people. And of our own marriages. Isn't that the way it works? I mean, it is a reality, live-action drama. And sometimes, sometimes it can be funny, but sometimes it can be tragic. The popular media, if you're just following what's being said in our popular media at this point in time and the public sentiment, you'd think that the state of marriage is in total disarray. Some people would argue that society's acceptance of individuals' demand for personal fulfillment has freed and allowed all sorts of irresponsible and hedonistic people to flit from one relationship to another. There are those, okay? However, marriage still seems to possess an aurora that elevates it above simply being a living arrangement, a convenient way to satisfy one's particular hormonal desires. There is an aurora of marriage that makes it different. Most Canadians only marry once in their lives. Less than 1% of Canadians walk down the aisle of marriage 3 or 4 times. It's really, there's, in many cases, marriage is indicating a high relationship, a high quality of relationship. And it's far better, and it's far higher in its quality and its lasting benefit to the people involved than just a common law relationship. Marriage suggests that there is something transcendent about its nature. And this is the view and perception of even a secular agency like Statistics Canada. Because I'm getting some of the statistics from Statistics Canada, which is really a great source, but 9 in 10 adult Canadians, that's 89%, have been legally married only once. Of the people who get married and who are married in Canada, 89% have only done it one time. They've only tied the knot once. 10% of those legally married have tied the knot twice. But it's only 1% of legally married Canadians who've married 3 or 4 times. It really drops off remarkably. Statistics Canada notes that, you would expect that people who marry multiple times, that they're keen believers in the value of marriage and family. But they're saying the data is showing something different. What they've done in their surveys and censuses is showing something different. They say serial marriers, and they call them serial marriers. I love that. Serial marriers are significantly less likely to claim that being married is important or very important to their happiness. People who are serial marriers, 69% of them says that marriage is important or very important to their personal happiness. But 82% of people who've married only once say it is important or very important to their personal happiness. Expectations about marriage play a major role in determining the risk of a breakup. An emphasis on family-oriented, child-rearing relationships is much more stable than an emphasis where the marriage is focused on individually based personal fulfillment, mindsets or perspectives. That's a total and complete difference. The lack of commitment to the ideal of marriage may become a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is according to Statistics Canada. This is the way they look at it. A lack of commitment to the ideal of marriage may become a self-fulfilling prophecy. They say, since it is a key factor associated with marital collapse, people who do not believe that marriage is important to them to be happy have a predicted risk of both first and subsequent marriage failure of 170% to 330% higher than people who feel it is very important. If you don't have that commitment to the ideal of marriage, you're at least almost twice to better than 3 times more likely to get divorced. That is a remarkable figure. Are Christians any different from our society as a whole? Or does the church really just sort of mirror society? Does Christianity make really any difference to people as far as whether their marriages stick, whether their marriages endure, whether they're everlastingly married, whether they're ever married? Well, most people would agree that the church is not immune when it comes to the divorce rate. Statistics in the United States show that 60% of the people who identify themselves as Christians but who rarely attend church are divorced or will divorce. 60%. I mean, that's remarkable. They identify themselves as Christians, but it's not having a tremendous impact on their life. 38% of those who attend church regularly have been divorced. Yeah, divorce rates run somewhere in the neighborhood of 38%, after over a 30-year period to maybe into the low 40s, even on a 50-year period. But they say that 38% of those who attend church regularly have been divorced. Active conservative Protestants who regularly attend church, however, are 35% less likely to divorce when compared to those who have absolutely no affiliation. So people who just think, well, I'm Christian, but they never attend church. Well, these are the people. They are no different from our society. This is really where it's at. Nominally attending conservative Protestants, however, notice this, nominally attending conservative Protestants, that means they occasionally darken the door, are 20% more likely to divorce than people who are secular Americans. As they said, over 80% of Canadian adults will eventually marry. It's only the 20% that do not enter into marriage, who do not become legally married. Now, many of the things, and there have been lots of studies done. For instance, the people of the focus on the families down there in their family formation area, they've studied this. And their director, Glenn Stanton, noted, he said he believes that differentiation must be made between those who are truly practicing their faith and those who are simply affiliated with a church. According to Stanton at the Focus of the Family People, he says church affiliation means nothing. Church affiliation means nothing. What counts is actively praying together, reading the Bible together, doing something together spiritually to nourish each other. That makes a difference. That is the key to divorce-proofing a marriage. It is vital. Now, there has been there's been a certain amount of controversy over Christian divorce rates. But there's no doubt about the fact that the church is not immune to what's going on in the world by any means. We're influenced by these things. The factor that is making the difference is religious commitment. In any sort of denomination you're looking at, of all the things, whether we're talking the Church of God or one of these other things. And Stanton makes this point. He says this, and I'm going to quote from him. Couples who regularly practice any combination of serious religious behaviors and attitude, attend church nearly every week, read their Bibles and spiritual materials regularly, pray privately and together, generally take their faith seriously, living not as perfect disciples, but serious disciples. These people, Stanton is saying, enjoy significantly lower divorce rates than mere church members, the general public, and unbelievers. Well, that's what we would expect, isn't it? Really, from many things, for Christianity, for this book to have any sort of influence in your life, you've got to be involved with it. You've got to be involved with it. Just carrying it around as an iconic symbol doesn't mean anything. Jesus said, it's not the book. It's not that I have it in my hand that does anything to me or does anything. Holding a Bible doesn't make me holy. Walking into a church building doesn't make you holy, isn't going to change you. What happens is what goes on in between your ears from what you hear and what you study and what you learn and what God's Spirit inspires when you're on your knees or when you're praying. This is what is going to make the disciple different from anyone else in the society. Without that, we're just like everybody else. We are human beings, after all. We are in the flesh. If the last time you checked, we are in the flesh. Why is marriage? Because we've had, even in the Church of God, there have been quite a bit of divorce. It's quite a bit of divorce. Why is marriage so challenging in the church? Well, we are living in the world. We're people. We're influenced by our culture and by our times. We're influenced by the pressure of of what's going on in daily life. We have financial pressures. We have all these other things as human beings. But we have something more in the church than just the people out in the world have as far as pressure upon us. And what we have upon us is that pressure because we know we should be living up to something better. we know we should be trying to live up to something better. And that's sometimes a pressure because we don't, do we? Sometimes we find that, we realize we are just very, very human. Stanton said this. He had a comment, he said, in talking about marriage. He said, if people go into marriage without an appreciation and understanding that Christ must be the center of the marriage, they're not coming together for their own sake, but for, people have to understand they're not coming together for their own sake, but for the sake of His kingdom, for Christ's sake. That's what they need. If people have Christ at the center, if they have this vision of that they're coming together, that it's two making something greater than the sum of just the two elements, the two parties to the marriage. If they don't have that, it creates a real problem. They have expectations perhaps that they're missing, that are faulty, that are missing some aspect of the truth. Why is it so difficult for two human beings just to come together and live happily ever after? Why is it so difficult? Well, Okay, let's go to Amos. Amos chapter 3 and verse 3. If you turn with me to the book of Amos, Amos chapter 3 and verse 3. And I'll read this first one in the King James, okay, because it's nice. It's classic in the King James. That's one of the quote-unquote minor prophets, and a prophet is only minor from this standpoint. They call them minor prophets just because their books weren't as long as one of the major prophets who had more, more stuff down there, but it's God's word, and there's nothing minor about God's word, okay, I'll have you know. But anyways, in Amos 3, chapter 3 and verse 3, and again, this is the KJV, it said, "Can two walk together except they be agreed? Will a lion roar in the forest when he hath no prey? Will a young lion cry out in his den if he has taken nothing? Can a bird fall in a snare upon the earth where no gin is for him? Shall one take up a snare from the earth and have taken nothing at all?" No, two can't walk together unless they agree, which way are they going? What is their direction? How fast are they going to walk? If one wants to walk a whole lot faster than the other one, well, they're not going to walk together, are they? It'll be like the classic, some of the portrayals of traditional Chinese society where the man walks, straight ahead and his wife walks 10 paces behind because she dare not walk side by side with him. Okay, that's Confucian culture. Okay, that was the way that they looked at it. But that's not what our ideal has been in the West. We have two that walk together, and we can't walk together in our marriages except we have a certain amount of agreement, because it's the speed and the direction, how we're doing these things. It's very important. So we have to have a certain amount of communication and agreement. It's very important. Now, one of the problems that we have in our marriages, very clearly, because we are human beings, is selfishness. It is probably one of the major problems we have in Christian marriages. Because, whether you're secular or whether you're religious, whatever you might be, we're having to deal with innate selfishness. We come out of the womb being selfish, and we want the attention. We want our mom's attention, and we're going to holler our head off until we get it because we feel we have needs. I'm not saying they're not real, but we have needs of one sort or another. And people, we tend to be selfish as people, as individuals, as human beings. Let's go to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. Apostle Paul addressed this, and this is one of the things we have to work with as a Christian in our marriages. Let's think about this. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 1, and I want you to think of this scripture from the standpoint of marriage and being ever married. Therefore, if there is any consolation in Christ, okay, if there's any benefit, if there's any good that's coming from our belief and from our practice, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and mercy, fulfill my joy by being like-minded like Christ, having the same love of Christ, being of one accord, Christ and his disciples, of one mind. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit. And that's a real hard one to do. It's hard for people to do it in the church, okay? That's one of the reasons why the Church of God is just not one body, but we have hundreds of different bodies because we've had a certain amount of selfish ambition and conceit that's gone on. People feel like, I have to be God's apostle. Well, this is just conceit. Selfish ambition. I'm the one God's using and nobody else. Okay, this is selfish ambition and conceit. We see that, okay, it's very clearly, when we apply it from this, but in a marriage concept, think about that. Verse 3, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself or herself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. Basic Christian principle. Applies to how we do things in church. It applies in our marriages and how we do things at home. We can't have this attitude, with our spouses to say, my way or the highway, buddy. Hit the road, Jack, We can't have that attitude, okay, if we want to be Christians, first of all, and if we want to continue to be married, second of all, okay? This is one of the things we have to get rid of, is a selfish ambition and or conceit. It's critically important. Newly married young people, men and women, have to get used to this. They have to get used to sharing household duties. I know many a young man, when it comes to picking up his clothes, which he may be used to, when he was single, he opened the door and just drop them wherever they might be, and the dishes can pile up. Things can grow on those dishes, and he only washes the dishes when he actually needs a pot. Then he just pulls them out of the thing and washes it, and then does whatever he does and lets it sit there till the next time he needs it for the next feeding. Well, yeah, I've been in apartments like that. Well, I was also single at one time too, okay, before I got married. I remember, I haven't forgotten what I was like. And we have to work on growing from that point to something different. We have to learn to eliminate this selfish, focused, inconsiderate attitude that may come so naturally and ingrained to us. I remember one of the things when we were first married. I don't know what my wife was saying to my mother-in-law, but there must have been something, or when she came and visited and saw me in action, she must have gotten some sort of idea and clued into, yeah, here's this guy, he's 24, 25, and she looked at this and she sent my wife, my lovely wife, this little plaque, and it said, basically it was a very simple statement: this is an equal opportunity kitchen. This is an equal opportunity kitchen. That means I own the dirty dishes as much as my wife did. I own the meal preparation and cleanup just as my wife did. And that's true, okay? There's nothing written in the Bible that tells women, your job is to wash all the dishes and cook all. There's nothing in there that talks about that in the Bible. It doesn't do it. It's not there. Many of these things, it's a question of putting things together and making things happen on a day-to-day basis, being flexible, using each other's talents, being respectful of the other person, and pulling your fair share, better than your fair share, okay? Because it's not, well, she's not doing my part, and so I don't have to do my part, No, it's that I need to do as much as I can. It's a different way of looking at things, of going, as Jesus would say, the extra mile. You were obligated, okay? That whole symbol that Jesus said in the ancient world, in occupied Judea, when the Romans were the overlords, okay? When their armies were marching along the roads, they'd march along the roads. The soldiers in those days, they had to carry a lot of their own gear. You'd have to have your spears and your shield and your bow and your arrows and all this stuff. And this stuff weighed, okay? It wasn't made out of Kevlar or plastic. It weighed. It was iron, and it was wood, and it had real weight. And these guys, it was a law that they could come through a village, they'd look at all the boys and men and say, you're giving me a hand. Here's my stuff. For the next mile, you get to carry it. I get a break. They could make you do that. And of course, people didn't argue because you could lose your head. Okay, you didn't argue about that because you could lose your head. You were responsible to give, to go the mile. But Jesus was saying, and to the Jews of his time who were used to that sort of thing, and it didn't matter whether you thought you were a poobah and had high status, and I'm a big shot. No. The Romans would pick anybody. They see you're carrying. Okay, that's the way it worked. You're there. You're a body. You're helping out. Okay, from this standpoint, you were required to go 1 mile. They had the miles, marked off on the roads. By the way, the Romans did that to keep track of everything. I suppose they made notes so they could write, Publius writes to Savannius, whatever. We made 15 miles today. You know how military reports are and all that sort of thing. Well, Jesus said to the Jews of his time, who hated to be a subject people, he said, if they make you do 1 mile, do 2. Go ahead. Give them a hand. Give them a break. Yeah, they may be your despised overlords, but go ahead. Give them a hand. Go the extra mile. That's where that statement comes from. Go the extra mile. And in our marriages, do we go the extra mile? And things can change in marriage. Life happens. The funny thing is you get married and then life happens and you have to adapt. At some point in times, maybe you can do no dishes because your hands are full of sores and cuts and stuff like this, and so you can't do it because it's pain. You stick your hand in the water and you go, ouch. That's when the other person steps in and does something like that, or you're sunburned or something. The different ways you have to deal with things and adjust to life. Go the extra mile. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, that each esteem others better than himself. Now, one of the other problems that we have is, of course, there are different personality types. I'm sure at some point in time I'm going to do some sermons on personality types because we have them. He is a character, she said at the top of our voice. He is. He's a piece of work. Okay, this guy can be, some guys and women, because it's not, gender specific. Some people can be real characters and it can be difficult. After all, only 80% of Canadian adults get married. There are 20% who, some of them are probably better off never marrying because they can't make themselves happy. They're certainly not going to make someone else happy. Some people have a personality that is, will drive somebody else off screaming into the night. All right, this is one of the things, of course, and before you marry, you have to know, can I live with this personality? Okay, all right, can I live with this personality? Because if you have somebody who is, maybe the emotional screamer or whiner, meeting somebody who is a strong, silent type, there's going to be two forces that are like ships passing in the night. There's not going to be the communication. There's not going to be the communication. You have to have a little bit of wisdom. You definitely have to have the wisdom. Is this personality, is it going to mesh? Can we be friends? Can we be friends and not just bunkmates? Really. A lot of people today, being a bunkmate is they think that's where it's really at, but no, it's not. That gets to be nothing that's, ordinarily, or, that's not required these days that you be married to have bunkmates, from that sort of thing. But to be married, it does take, it definitely does take having some personalities where you can be friends. It's important. Now, let's take a look. I want to see in the Bible, we have an example of the differences in personality. I want to read this here. Let's go to the book of Acts. We don't normally, in some of these, when it comes to a marriage, you may never have heard this quoted by any other minister in the Church of God as relates to marriage. But let me tell you something. If you're in ministry in combination with some other person, it's practically like being in a marriage in some ways, okay, if you're having to do things. And in Paul, in the ancient world, when they were traveling and doing these things, they had to live together. They spent a lot of time together. It was practically like being married. They weren't, okay? They weren't. I want to make that point very clear by any means. There wasn't this sort of, some modern liberal theologians or Christians will try to say, well, maybe Paul, was, horsing around or some of these things. But no, that's not what we're talking about. But anyways, in Acts 15 and verse 35, we see this. Acts 15, verse 35. Now, this is right after a major church conference, by the way. A major church conference in which these two men, Paul and Barnabas, had gone up there, and they worked together very closely to make a theological point. Very closely to make a theological point. They had been working together. They had been preaching together and conducting their ministry together. They've been doing it pretty well. Except now Paul and Barnabas were staying in Antioch with many others, teaching and preaching the gospel, the word of the Lord. And after certain days, Paul sent to Barnabas, let's go back and see how our brethren are doing in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord. And Barnabas was determined to take with them John, who was called or surnamed Mark. But Paul did not think it good to take him, because he had departed from them at Pamphylia and did not go with them to the work. Okay, we have a difference of opinions. As a result, such a sharp contention arose between them that they parted from one another, and Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed after being committed to the grace of the God by the brethren. And he passed through the churches of Syria and Cilicia, establishing the churches. Wow, they had a fight. And, Paul was a very, very strong personality. And Barnabas was quieter. Barnabas was the son of consolation. He was a fellow who would, he'd make it happen. He'd make things work. He even got Paul into the ministry to begin with. He found him. Said, we have, we need to reach these Greek-speaking people, and you have the background and knowledge to do this. Barnabas did that. But then Paul, when it came time to who were they going to take as their assistant to go with them, to help them, to carry some of the load with them as they did this traveling and in their evangelistic tour, they had a major head-to-head, and it didn't work. It didn't work. They had to separate. They didn't, by the way, they didn't disfellowship each other and make a whatever, all this sort of stuff that, Church of God leaders these days, do. Church of God leaders these days, you don't agree with me, they stab you in the back, and they do say all sorts, they rumor and say all this sort of stuff. They fire them, see who can fire who, and all this sort of stuff. This is the way we do it in the church these days. It's not very Christian. But we see a lot of that going on. But anyways, Paul and Barnabas, they had a personality clash and decision. A lot of marriages, when you have strong personalities, they can be different. Paul was pretty forceful and upfront, and Barnabas was quieter and more facilitating, but he had strong beliefs. You have to understand that and see that. We're not talking about who was a Christian and who was not a Christian. These were two Christians, but they couldn't work it out. They had to separate. Sometimes that may happen in the church too, but that's obviously not the ideal by any means. Other personality types that you see, you have, the logical, science, math mind versus the artistic feeler sort. Okay, usually, of course, the scientific math mind is the guy, okay? I'm using a generality, okay? But if you go to most engineering schools, overwhelmingly they're guys. That's even in the 21st century, it's still that way. Despite all the policies they put in there to try to cram women in these places, they're not too many. I'm being serious. That's just the way it has been and is, okay, from this standpoint. But then I can't help but think, of some of those who I've known, and I have a very specific, I'm not going to mention names because I don't want to embarrass anybody, but some people are dead and some people are alive, and some people are in the fellowship of the church and some are not, but I know their stories. I know their stories, but I will not out the guilty. But, or those who were, those who were involved. But there were these two, and there was a fellow I knew and his wife, and they were exactly like that, and they couldn't work it out. It drove each other bananas. They couldn't make it happen. And then you have the time, I can think of just my in-laws who are no longer with us. My father-in-law and my mother-in-law, they were very different types of people. My dad was, my father-in-law used to be the type of guy who liked to stay at home. He enjoyed being at home, and he didn't need lots of other people to enjoy himself. He liked to go out there and work on the car or work on his projects. I mean, he had a great workbench and tools and stuff like this. He loved doing this. That's all that's really all he needed, to go to work and do his thing, come home and do some of these things. But his wife, she liked to be around other people. She liked to do social things. She liked to, go out and go places, and they had to work it out. And I know it wasn't always easy. I know it wasn't always easy, because sometimes when the frustration level would rise to the point where it's sort of bubbling a little bit, my mother-in-law would mention something, a few comments, and then you'd catch the drift of what's going on. But they, it's the type of thing that they knew each other long enough. They knew how to give, how to accommodate, how to work with each other so they could continue on to what they needed to do. One of the big problems we have in our society right now is a real emphasis on instant gratification. People want happiness. They want, good things. They want appreciation, and they want it now. They don't want to wait for it by any means. It's the sort of thing, if you don't love me or understand me right now in the way I want, I'm out of here. Okay? And unfortunately, a lot of marriages are breaking up at this point in time because that's actually what's going on. So our story, we have to be willing. We have to be willing to accommodate and to wait and to be patient. These things are important. If there is a lack of commitment to the ideal of marriage, if there's a lack of commitment to the vows that one has made to God, if there's a lack of having God at the center of one's life, then we can be just like the world in the church. There's nothing that's going to separate us. We're not better than anyone else just because all of a sudden we've been baptized, and attend church. That doesn't make us better than anybody in the world. The only thing that helps us to do more and to have solid marriages is when we're doing things God's way and we're actually having Him with us. Now, we have a story. I want to point out here a little something. We have the story of Michal and David in the Bible. The Bible does have some interesting stories that it comes up with. I mean, the Bible is not a marriage manual from that aspect. It wasn't just written on that one subject. It's very broad, but it touches on a whole variety of things. If we go to 1 Samuel, the book of 1 Samuel in the former prophets, 1 Samuel, and we have chapter 18, we see a love story here. 1 Samuel 18 and verse 14. 1 Samuel 18:14. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. And Saul saw how he behaved himself very wisely and was afraid of him. But all Judah and Israel loved David because he went out and came in before them. He was fighting their battles. And David said to Saul, "Behold, I will give you my older daughter Merab for a wife. Only you be brave, son, for me, and fight the Lord's battles." But Saul was actually not doing this because he cared for David, but because actually he wanted to kill him. And he was using it as a trap. But the story goes that, of course, that he was going to make Saul go out and fight the Lord's battles, and then he was going to give him his daughter. So, well, David did that. He did what Saul wanted him to do. But the first time with the oldest daughter, Merab, and here we're talking 1 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 19. And it came to pass at the time when Merab, the Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel the Maholathite to be his wife. In verse 20, and Saul's daughter Michal loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him, because he thought, well, okay, I didn't get David, didn't trap him up the first time with the first girl. Okay, maybe I can play him one more time. Okay, but the thing was that Saul discovered that Michal loved David. Michal loved her, and of course, David, it turns out, was infatuated, and hopefully loved Michal as well. And he went out, and there's this kind of a famous story where he went out and killed a pile of the enemies of Israel. It says killed 200 men of the Philistines and brought their foreskins, because that was proof of purchase, Make sure that he got out there in the battlefield. I mean, would have been kind of strange, saying, okay, I've done what you've had. Here it is, I kind of wonder, who actually had to do the counting. Which one of the king's servants would have to say, yeah, David met the tally. Okay, he's good. You got to give him your daughter now. But anyways, David ended up marrying Michal. Here he was, just a shepherd boy marrying the king's daughter, almost a fairy tale. And then they were going to live happily ever after, right? Here he is, David, kills Goliath, becomes a hero in Israel, smiting the Philistines, the enemy of the Lord, and he ends up being given the hand of the king's daughter, and wow, all of a sudden, life is going to be happily ever after? No. Not at all. That's not the way it works. Because as you see here, and you just go to the next chapter, 1 Samuel 19 and verse 11, Saul still was afraid of David. He was paranoid. And so he sent messengers to David's house to watch him and to kill him in the morning. And David's wife, Michal, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you shall be killed. And Michal let David down through a window, and he left and hurried away and escaped. And Michal took an image and laid it in a bed, sort of like a big dummy, and laid it in the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair on its head and covered it with a cloth. And then Saul sent messengers to take David, and she said, he's sick. And Saul sent messengers to see David, saying, bring him to me in the bed so that I may kill him. And the messengers came in, and behold, the image was in the bed with a pillow of goat's hairs for his head. And Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me and sent away my enemy so that he has escaped? She was willing to confront her dad and trick him, and because she loved David enough, she was willing to do that. But as you know the story, of course, David had to run and head for the hills. He had to hide. Later on, of course, in 1 Samuel 25:44, you see that Saul gave Michal, his daughter, to another man. I mean, women were property. She had no say on it. He gave her to another man, Phalti. She became his wife. But in the course of time, in 2 Samuel 3:13, David eventually would get her back. It's part of a political bargaining process. After Saul was dead, he said that they wanted to have a certain amount of peace between David and some of the soldiers on the other side who had been serving Saul, his enemy. Then they were going to have to give him back Michal, his wife. And they eventually did. And they separated Michal from the man that she'd been given to in marriage and brought her back to David, which is an interesting point. You can look at it later in Deuteronomy 25, verse 1 to 5, where it talks about this whole thing that if a man divorces a woman and she goes and becomes another man's wife and then they get divorced, she can't go back to her first husband. This was one of the laws in the Torah, and that's in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 to 5. And this is one of the things, however, David insisted, he probably should have known better from this standpoint, but he insisted on having Michal back. whether it was status, whether it was pride, whether he still loved her, I'm not sure, because they had several other wives at this point in time. But we see there was something that was missing here. In 2 Samuel 6 and verse 14, we have this whole incident later on as David is now entering into his rule, and he's bringing in the Ark of the Covenant of God to the tabernacle to worship, okay, at this point in time, and to restore the Ark to the tabernacle and to revive all the worship and the things the way they should be at that point in time. And it came to pass that when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed oxen and fatlings. And David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was girded with a linen ephod, sort of like a kilt, okay? And at that point in time, I don't know, was he wearing underwear? We have no idea. But anyways, and David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the ram's horse. And it came to pass, as the ark of the Lord came to the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. She despised him. And they got into a real argument. They got into an argument. She thought it was totally inappropriate behavior, and that he was doing this to try to attract other women, young women and this sort of thing. And David got his foot up because he felt that, well, what, you're a king's daughter and you think I'm nothing? You just think I'm dirt just because of my background? They got into a major argument, and they couldn't solve it. And of course, from that standpoint, they separated, or David didn't divorce her, but he didn't visit her. He put her away. It's a sad story. It's a sad story that both could, they suffered because they both had a lack of appreciation. They had a lack of patience. They had a lack of kindness for each other. And so really the love that they had started out with just died. It just died. It withered away. All the pressures of society around us, it can create divisions of different sort. We may not have the political problems that separated David and Michal, but it might be something else. There's family, a job, a mortgage, outlook, politics, church fellowship. All these things can end up separating one person, one spouse from the other. But this is not the way we should approach this. Marriage is to be a union. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 3. 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 3. I'll read this in the New Living Translation. 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 3. And again, this is one of the things, we don't think of this verse, these particular verses, in relationship to marriage. But just think of it from that standpoint, that you have two people and they should be having one goal. But here Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, okay, where they're having a problem of having different competing goals. He said, for you are still controlled by your sinful nature. This is what he's telling the church. You're still controlled. These are church members. You're still controlled by your sinful nature. You are jealous of one another and quarrel with each other. Okay? Well, it happens in marriage too. And, Paul could say it just as well in some sort of marriage counseling between people. They're in the church, they're disciples. You're still controlled by your sinful nature. And you are jealous of one another and quarrel with each other. Doesn't that prove you are controlled by your sinful nature? Aren't you living like people of the world? Yeah, Christians are supposed to be different than the people in the world. Our divorce statistics should be much different from the people in the world, not, sort of different. When one of you says, I'm a follower of Paul, and another says, I follow Paul, aren't you just acting like people of the world? When you say, my idea or my Church of God group is better than your Church of God group, what is he saying? Aren't you just acting like you're carnal people? After all, who is Apollos and who is Paul? We are only God's servants through whom you believe the good news. Each of us did the work of the Lord gave us. I planted the seed in your hearts, and Apollos watered. These were two people. They were collaborating. They were working together for the same purpose, to build the church. And in a marriage, it's the same thing. The husband and the wife are working together to build the same purpose, to fulfill the same ideal. It's not important who does the planting and who does the watering. Okay, the task, who cares? What's important is that God makes the seed grow. That God makes the seed grow. And in a marriage, the seed is love. In the marriage, the seed is really love. Priorities can divide us. The whole story in Genesis 27-28 of the story about Isaac and Rebekah, and they had different views of how they saw their sons, Isaac and Jacob. They had completely different views of how they saw it. Isaac liked the idea. Esau and Jacob. Excuse me. We have the married couple, Rebekah and Isaac, and then their sons, Esau and Jacob. And the interesting thing is that, you see, Isaac favored Esau. He liked Esau. He had some of these things, but Rebekah favored Jacob. But there was something in what Rebekah saw that had its more spiritual insight than what Isaac had at that point in time. Because you have this whole story that the Bible preserves, but here you had a question of priorities that were divided. Isaac came to understand that, yeah, the one who was to be the clan chief, the one who was to carry on their covenant, their relationship that had been established by Abraham, had continued to live that covenant and to hold up their end, that person needed to be Jacob, not Esau. Because Esau took these things too lightly. He despised his birthright. He despised really the values of what was going there. But the problem is that Isaac and Rebekah, they weren't talking about it. Their priorities were divided, and it created problems in the family and heartache for themselves, because it ended up, as you know, they had to send Jacob away when this decision was made. Expectations, and roles, what we decide to do and how we divide up the chores in a marriage, or what something needs to, how we arrange things. This is between the two people to arrange. But we have to, be flexible with that. There are a lot of men who have the idea that their wives are there just to be their maids. And it's not true. And there are those women who have the idea, who look upon the man that he's just a meal ticket. And this is a problem too. A husband who wants to be the provider and he needs that for his ego or his feeling of self-worth, he might not appreciate his wife to be a businesswoman. Or a woman who might be uncomfortable in business role, but her husband wants to put her out to work. We need the money. They have to work it out. It doesn't need to be a cause for conflict. The Bible is open to this idea of what from this aspect. In Proverbs 31, Proverbs of a virtuous woman, Proverbs 31 and verse 16, it says, it makes this point here, and I'm reading this in the New Living Translation. She goes to inspect a field and buys it. With her earnings, she plants a vineyard. She is energetic and strong, a hard worker. She makes sure her dealings are profitable. So the Bible allows, you can't just, the view of the Church of God that we had sometimes back in the 1950s, well, it didn't really take this into account. And as a church and as organizations, we've had to grow on this, that, from this standpoint, the Bible doesn't have, extremely rigid views of how we're going to divide up some of the opportunities and responsibilities and tasks in a marriage. It's between the two people to look at what kind of skills and talents do they bring to the table. Because it's a union so that, they can each contribute what they're good at and bring it together, because each one has talents, has God-given gifts, and that needs to be nurtured, and it needs to be brought to flower and put into production for the benefit of the marriage and for the benefit of God. But too often, couples will, after they get married, expecting to live happily ever after, all of a sudden they discover they can have different perspectives on so many of these different things. Spending money, raising kids, house chores, happy ever after takes work. It's not a fairy tale. It's really not. Our circumstances can really make things difficult for us. We live in a world where everything is changing. Now I want to read, let's go to Psalm 55. Whether we're talking, all these things, finances, health, children, religion, which are, of course, some of the biggest areas, what happens sometimes is that when we get into these things and we're saying, I have a different perspective, okay? That really bothers me or something like this. What happens is that sometimes we can turn the one who should be our closest friend and the one we love, we can, if we're not careful and we're not circumspect about what we say and what we do, we can turn people who are closest to us into our enemies, and this is a tragic thing. Let's go to Psalm 55, and I want to read in verse 12. And this is the New Living Translation. The psalmist is writing this. He's making this point. And it's again, while it's not necessarily written directly about marriage, it's written very closely about two people who are close. It's not an enemy who taunts me. I could bear that. It's not my foes who so arrogantly insult me. I could have hidden from them. Yeah. Okay, if somebody out in the street or even your boss, taunts you or it says nasty things to you, you can, these things you can brush off. But it gets not so easy to do that when it's closer to home. Verse 13, instead it was you, my equal, my companion and close friend. Well, that should be your spouse, your husband or your wife. And when it comes from them, it's very, very difficult. What good fellowship we once enjoyed as we walked together to the house of God in the church. There's so many families, husband and wife, used to do that. As for my companion, he betrayed his friends. He broke his promises. His words are as smooth as butter, but in his heart is war. His words are soothing as lotions, but underneath are daggers. Because all of a sudden, instead of love, they had hate. Instead of love, they had hate. Love is, of course, the most important thing that a marriage, to be successful, to be ever married, that is required. Without love, of course, marriage is just going through the motions. While we may, decide to walk together, we want to walk together joyously. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 13. I want you to look at this. Sometimes maybe it's we don't think of it from the standpoint of a description of what we should have as an ideal in marriage. But if we have this as an ideal of marriage, then it's going to make it far less likely that our marriages will flounder, that they'll fail, that we'll end up in one of the statistic pool of those who couldn't make it happen. In Canada, what is it? It's 13 or 14% of the adult population have been divorced. I mean, that's not talking about the number of marriages. It's about a third of the marriages, so better than a third of the marriages. Almost, 38, 39%, over long term don't make it. But the fundamental thing of always, if you're going to, if you don't have this sentiment and you don't have the purpose of the ideal in front of you, it's going to be very hard to sustain it. 1 Corinthians 13, I'm going to want to read this in the Phillips translation. We'll start in verse 1. I like how J.B. Phillips put this. He says, if I speak with the eloquence of men and angels, okay, and in the sweet talking that men might do to begin with, and that a man and a woman can exchange when they're first getting to know each other, the words of intimacy that they'll start to express about how they feel about each other. If I speak with the eloquence of men and angels but have no love, I have become nothing more than blaring brass or crashing cymbal. If I have the gift of foretelling the future and hold in my mind not only all human knowledge but the very secrets of God, and also if I have that absolute faith which can move mountains but have no love, I amount to nothing at all. If I dispose of all that I possess, yes, even if I give my own body to be burned, but have no love, I have achieved precisely nothing. This love of which I speak is slow to lose patience. It looks for a way of being constructive. It is not possessive. It is neither anxious to impress, nor does it cherish inflated ideas of its own importance. Love has good manners and does not pursue selfish advantage. It is not touchy. It does not keep account of evil or gloat over the wickedness of other people. On the contrary, it is glad with all good men and women, all good that a husband or a wife do, when truth prevails. Love knows no limit to its endurance, no end to its trust, no fading of its hope. It can outlast anything. It is, in fact, the one thing that still stands when all else has fallen, and all gifts except love will be superseded one day. For if there are prophecies, they will be fulfilled and done with, and if there are tongues, the need for them will disappear. If there is knowledge, it will be swallowed up in truth, for our knowledge is always incomplete, and our prophecy is always incomplete. And when the complete comes, that is the end of the incomplete. When I was a little child, I talked and felt and thought like a little child. Now that I am a man, my childish speech and feeling and thought have no further significance to me. At the present, we are men, we are adults, looking at puzzling reflections in a mirror. The time will come when we shall see reality whole and face to face. And at present, all I know is a little fraction of the truth. But the time will come when I shall know it as fully as God now knows me. In this life, we have three great lasting qualities: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of them is love. If we are to have marriages that are different from marriages in the world, it is because we will embrace these lasting qualities of faith and hope and love. Faith in God, that He will fulfill His word in us. Faith that we have this vision of the future and that He answers our prayers and will help us to grow in the way that we need to do. And hope that we ourselves can meet our obligations, that we can meet the challenges of a marriage. It's not easy being married. But God has a purpose and He has a reason for why we are married. But to achieve this, to achieve and fulfill what God is saying, we have to do it. We have to have and develop this quality of love. All these different things are talking about the aspects. Good manners, not pursuing selfish advantage, not being touchy, not building up a script and keeping and pulling out every little wrong thing that your mate does and throwing it in their faces one more time. No, it's having the good of the other person in mind at all times. No limit to its endurance, no fading of its hope, outlasting anything. That's what we need, because we are still human beings. There's a lot more to be said about this. There's more even to be said about the vision and purpose and the work to be done. Because Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 9, it puts this. He says, we are His workmanship. We, the members of the church, men and women, husbands and wives, we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in Him. And marriage is one of those good works. And God has prepared it beforehand that we should walk in it. And we can walk successfully when we focus on the qualities of love. We'll have to visit this again because I think I've exhausted my time. I had actually a lot more to go into. But, hey, Next week, same time, same place. This is Jeff Patton.